We have an incredible treat today. It's not often that we bring back a speaker 3 years in a row. I was honored before we moved here to come speak at the Jerome to the Colorado OBGYN Society 3 years in a row, and that made us move here. So it's quite dangerous when we bring somebody back 3 years in a row. And we don't do it unless they are spectacular. And that's what Heather Mac Donald is. I'm sure many of you have read her pieces. I mean, all you had to do this morning was look in Wall Street Journal to see the piece that she wrote this morning. She is the Thomas Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor at City Journal, and the 2005 recipient of the Bradley Prize. She received her BA from Yale, MA from Cambridge, and a JD from Stanford. Not too shabby. Her work has covered a range of topics from higher education and immigration to policing and race relations. Her writing has appeared in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and New York Times, and she's author of several critically acclaimed books, including The Diversity Delusion and the New York Times bestseller, The War on Cops. Her newest book is for sale in the back, When Race Trumps Merit. And that's what we're going to talk quite a bit about here today. Does your workplace have too few Black people in top jobs? It's racist. Does your advanced math and science high school in your city have too many Asians? It's racist. Does your local museum employ too many white women? That's racist too. After the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, prestigious American institutions from the medical profession to the fine arts pleaded guilty to systemic racism. How else explain why Blacks are overrepresented in prison and underrepresented in C-suites and faculty lounges, their leaders asked. The official answer for those disparities is disparate impact, a once obscure legal theory that is now transforming our world. Any traditional standard of behavior or achievement that impedes exact racial proportionality in any enterprise is now presumed racist. Medical school admission tests, and we had Dr. Stanley Goldfarb here 3 weeks ago from the organization Do No Harm explain what was happening in medical schools. Expectations of scientific accomplishment in the award of research grants or the enforcement of criminal law all are under assault because they have a disparate impact on underrepresented minorities. Glenn Loury, who's the Merton Stoltz Professor of Social Sciences at Brown, who is an incredibly bright and erudite Black conservative, wrote the following. Heather Mac Donald has done it again in her new book, When Race Trumps Merit. It's a fact-filled, eloquent, and passionate critique of the drift towards relativism and mediocrity that is being visited upon by progressive elites in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is an important, persuasive, and morally righteous Jeremiad that deserves to be widely read. Would you please welcome Heather Mac Donald. Occasionally, we change seats. I'm not going to ask all of you to change seats, just us.
I hope that not union rates in New York City, the stagehands that move one chair to another make more than the concert violinists.
Absolutely.
There we go.
By the way, come over here if you would. This is not a skiing
No,
accident.
what's the point of breaking your foot if it's not when you're skiing? Very uninteresting. And I'm so grateful that anybody,
You're good, it's on.
it's on, okay, would take time off from this gorgeous afternoon. I mean, there's no way you can possibly acclimate yourself to this beauty, so I'm very grateful for anybody being here, because I would rather be outside in this light. Every year I come here, and I'm so grateful to be invited back. I simply am astounded by the loveliness of this town and the care that residents take to keeping it at such a level of almost hallucinogenic magnificence. The colors, the light, it's just extraordinary. So thank you for having me here.
Well, you really need to walk down the street in Aspen with Heather McDonald because look at those flowers. How did they do that?
Peonies, today we saw peonies. I haven't seen them all summer. That was great.
Heather, are we a culture and a country that is systemically racist? And what has our history over 250 years shown us about America and race relations? This could probably take 45 minutes just to answer.
Well, let's make a distinction that is, frankly, seems to be unable for anybody else to make between the past and the present. I think we can be ruthlessly honest about America's past, and let's not whitewash it. And to be perfectly honest, I think many conservative histories do whitewash America's past. They say, yeah, there was slavery, we fought it in the Civil War, we lost 500,000, and we had the Civil Rights Movement, and we passed some good laws banning the Jim Crow segregation, therefore we're okay. I've been on a two-year, three-year Audible reading tour at this point about Black history, civil rights history, and it's absolutely chilling how gratuitously nasty white Americans were for so long towards Blacks, how they did define their own identity, it seems, as often as they could by putting Blacks down, and it's heartbreaking to read. And that as late as the 1940s, 1950s, when you see Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington dressed to the nines, doing everything they could to live up to bourgeois values. And we still segregated them. We still told them you can't be in this restaurant or that hotel. It breaks my heart, it really does. And I struggle on a daily basis for what an adequate history of America would look like, because there still are so much to be proud of. The American entrepreneurial spirit is stunning, nothing like it. The waves upon waves of discoveries, inventions that began with the American Industrial Revolution. Astounding, where did this creativity come from? The courage that it took to settle the continent, and I'm not going to apologize for that. The individual true grit, the self-reliance, those were very real things. But I struggle with, does every statement that one says about America need a footnote but see Blacks? So I haven't resolved that. So I'm going to make that. The 1619 Project is right about some things. It is right that we were a white supremacist country. But let me also say this. The reality today in America is not white privilege, it is Black privilege. We have changed that much. Nobody would have believed it 40 years ago that we could have done such a flip. But I would like to see a single Black high school senior who thinks even in his dreams of putting his race down as white. He would never do that because he knows that being Black today is his ticket to advancement. And if I were a straight white male, I would be considering quite deeply whether I could get away with checking the black box on my college application, because that would allow me to be admitted to every single selective college in this country, to every single law school in this country, to every single medical school in this country, to every single engineering program in this country, with standardized test scores that would be automatically disqualifying if I were white or Asian. So the reality today is Black privilege. So let's be very clear. We were systemically racist, but we do not have to apologize for one instant for being systemically racist today, because we are not. Every single mainstream institution in this country, and if you've been in the corporate world recently, you should know this. The name of the game is how many Blacks can we hire and promote? Every single faculty search in every single college in this country is about one thing and one thing only: how many Blacks and females can we hire and promote? So this is not just a matter of empirical accuracy, and I am all for truth. It is wrong to speak lies about America today, but it's not just an abstract question of wanting to live with truth rather than wanting to live by lies. The narrative that America is systemically racist today is tearing down everything. It is all coming down. Every tradition of Western civilization, every meritocratic standard is all coming down because they have a disparate impact on Blacks, not because those standards are racist, but because there are vast academic skills gaps, there are vast crime gaps. And we have decided as a country that we would rather tear down our meritocratic standards that have a disparate impact than look head on at the pathological inner city culture that results in that disparate impact. And I cannot assert this more with more sort of dire, Cassandra-like urgency. We are really on a precipice right now. It is all coming down.
Thank you. Would you tell us a little bit about what's in your book with respect to disparate programs? And you touch on each industry in separate chapters. You touch on the arts, you touch on engineering, you touch on science. Would you just tell us briefly the impact that this movement has had?
Well, in medical school, as you heard from Stanley Goldfarb, and let me just say this belatedly, let me just give a trigger warning here. I'm going to speak about topics that make most well-meaning white Americans feel very uncomfortable. I believe in racial etiquette. I believe that as a default assumption, we wouldn't talk about these things. We would live with them. But I've concluded that the time for racial etiquette is over. Because right now, all you need to do to take down an institution or an individual is to call that institution or that individual white, and to say that those standards are having a disparate impact on Blacks, and we are putting a heck of a lot at risk. So I'm just warning you that I'm going to talk about things that people don't really want to hear about. So let's start with the facts that are why our medical schools are throwing their standards out the window. The average Black 12th grader does not possess even partial mastery of basic 12th grade math skills defined as being able to do arithmetic or read a graph. 8% of Black 12th graders are proficient in 12th grade math, and the number of Black 12th graders nationally in a national survey who are advanced in math is too small to show up statistically. The picture is not much better in reading. 50% of Black 12th graders do not possess even partial mastery of basic 12th grade math skills. Very few are proficient and very few are advanced in reading. Those academic skills gaps never close. Blacks graduate from college with the same skills gap, standard deviation of test scores between whites and Asians and blacks on the other. And so if medical schools or engineering schools maintained a single standard of admission, a colorblind standard of admission, they would have almost no black medical students or engineering students. And that has become politically unacceptable. And so for decades now, they have completely different standards of admission. They race norm. They have one set of standards and expectations for black students and one set of standards and expectations for white and Asian students, and test scores that would be automatically disqualifying if presented by whites and Asians are automatically grounds for admission if you're black, going into medical school, going into engineering school, going into physics. And so what happens then? You're admitting blacks to MIT who are not qualified. And let me just do a thought experiment and let's take it away from this very uncomfortable issue of race and talk about sex preferences. Same thing happens. If MIT, and we have an MIT engineer here tonight, and he went there in the halcyon days before MIT became one of the left-wing campuses in the country that are obsessed with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So he probably had a fairly male class, the golden era. Now MIT is obsessed with sex equity. So let's say they admitted me to MIT with 650s on my math SATs on an 800-point scale because they needed to have females. And all of my peers had been admitted without sex or gender preferences, and they had 800s or close to 800s on their math SATs. Do you think I would do well in my first year at MIT? Would I be comfortable? Would I do well in my calculus class? When the teaching would be geared toward my classmates with 800s on their math SATs, I would flounder. Not through any fault of MIT except for admitting me, when I would have done perfectly well at Boston College or Boston University, perfectly respectable institutions. I would flounder, and then the diversity bureaucrats would hone in for the kill, and they would tell me, if you don't feel at home here, it's because you're in a rape culture environment. You're surrounded by misogynists. When the reality is, the reason I'm not comfortable there is because I shouldn't have been admitted in the first place, because I should have been at a school where I was actually qualified. This happens to black students. They are all admitted. Every selective college in the country admits black students because of racial preferences, and they all struggle. And in medical school, they struggle. And we are now lowering the standards for medical licensing exams because not enough blacks are passing. Residencies are being pressured to have more blacks. Faculty, medical faculty, are being pressured to hire more blacks, regardless of how they've done in medical schools. The same thing is happening in engineering. And so when you are hit in a car accident and your body needs repairing, and a black doctor walks through the door of the emergency room, it is not racist to fear. It is rational to fear. Thanks to racial preferences, it is perfectly rational to think that that person, that doctor that walked through the door, may have been the so-called beneficiary all his life of racial preferences. If we didn't have racial preferences and a black doctor walked through the door, you wouldn't have any ground to fear. You would assume he's qualified like everybody else. Right now, you don't know that, and that's the same is true. Let me just jump. The Biden picks to go on the federal judiciary, he's put him on notice. He's choosing black females. let me tell you that involves the same dipping down into the applicant pool as for black doctors, and this is not a good thing for the quality of our jurisprudence.
What you certainly said there, and the discomfort with it, has to be underlined by the fact that for decades, blacks have been, and other minorities of color have been admitted to medical schools who qualify to be in medical school. My medical school class at NYU,
Good old days.
yes, at NYU, we had at least a dozen black men and women in my class who were excellent. They were good friends. These were very intelligent people like the rest of the class. What Heather is pointing out, and the discomfort that we all feel as she points it out, is the fact that that's not necessarily the case. While there are still applicants who rise up and do as well as the other applicants and have every reason to be admitted, the difference is the change in standards. I remember Dr. Goldfarb telling us 2.5, 3 weeks ago that the head of the curriculum, the female who was the head of the curriculum above him, said to him one afternoon, "We just have too much science in this curriculum." And that's why that lady's mouth just dropped open. And that's why you have to be concerned about who walks in. Maybe not right now, but certainly 5, 10 years from now, when this has really taken a toll on the kinds of docs that we will be seeing for our care, because remember, we'll be in our 70s and 80s then, and we will need excellent care, the kind of excellent care we believe that occurs in America today. Would you tell us your thoughts, please, about affirmative action decades ago and then in the present day? In other words, when some people say, well, gee, it was necessary, and now today, after we have seen the Supreme Court decisions that have come down over the past week to 10 days.
Well, first of all, let me say I don't like the term affirmative action. It sometimes slips out involuntarily, but I use the phrase racial preferences, which is not ambiguous. Affirmative action is ambiguous. It had this aura around it when it was first begun by Lyndon Johnson in the 60s, that all it meant was outreach. You know, let's make sure that we're going to a broader range of schools to recruit from, and that, you know, we're making sure we're advertising widely. And maybe it meant if you have 2 equal applicants, you put your thumb on the scale for the black applicant. That I would not object to. If it really was a question of a tiebreaker, that's fine with me. But it never meant that, really. It was always about double standards. It was always about racial preferences at the expense of merit. So I am never going to concede that that type of racial preference of taking students in who were not qualified was ever a good thing. I think it is worst of all for the alleged beneficiaries. I think it is an act of cruelty on the part of these damn college presidents who care more about whether they can scoop up as many remotely qualified blacks into their class so they can look out over a sea of suitably diverse faces than the actual experience of those black students brought into academic environments for which they are not qualified. As I say, I think that's cruel. And ironically, Harvard, which was one of the 2 plaintiffs in the recent Supreme Court rulings of the end of last month, the end of their term, Harvard initially was so naive that it said, okay, we're going to really do a lot of social reparations work here. And they brought in students sort of basically from the ghetto that were both low academic qualifications and low poverty. And it was such a total disaster, both in terms of just burning out flagrantly in terms of academic performance, but also just socially and crime-wise. They said, well, we're never going to do that again. So they quickly said, no more poverty, please. We're going to choose like really rich, the most rich black kids we can find, and we're still going to have vast skills gaps, but heaven forbid we like do anything on a socioeconomic basis. But I think it was wrong from the start. The solution has got to come in closing that skills gap, not papering it over. And the next question is then, so who's responsible for closing the skills gap? And I get the question all the time from audiences, well, yes, you know, there's this terrible skills gap, what can we do about it? And I'm gonna be very honest with you guys. I'm sick of that question. My response is, there's nothing more that we can do. We have been trying for decades. We have spent trillions in redistributing wealth in the form of welfare, massive per capita expenditures in Title I schools. We have been trying charters, we've been trying vouchers, the left has been trying more school funding. The solutions, you know, that we've all got our pet solutions, but we have been trying. At this point, there is nothing more that the outside world can do. We cannot make that child take his textbook home to study. You talk to inner city, there's a few inner city teachers who have some guts to speak out about what they see in their classroom. Otherwise, there seems to be a code of silence. But I've observed inner city classrooms in New York City. Those are not classrooms conducive for learning, and the fault is not just the teachers' unions. That's a conservative safe harbor. It's all teachers' unions, teachers' unions, teachers' unions. I'm sorry, the family is not supporting and encouraging academic achievement. And until more black parents say, have you been to school today? What did you learn? Have you taken your textbook home to do your homework? When's your next test? Are you studying for it? Are you staying in at night rather than running the streets with your gang buddies? The way you learn to read is putting in the work to do it. The way you learn arithmetic is putting in the work to learn those sums. The outside world can't change it. There is a stigma against so-called acting white in the black community, which defines academic effort as acting white and as a sellout to your race. And as long as that ethic remains, there is nothing more that we can do. We all should emulate Asian parents. But if I have a thought experiment, if blacks acted like Asians in all things related to academic success for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, you name it, and we still saw large racial disparities, and yet they were putting in the work, and yet they were still behind economically, then I would say, okay, let's talk about systemic racism, because it's otherwise inexplicable. But right now, the disparities are not inexplicable. They are absolutely, obviously based on the vast behavioral disparities that we see, the cultural disparities, the disparities in attitudes towards academic achievement, and of course the crime gaps. So the change has to come from the culture.
Thank you. Now, some pundits on the left, after the Supreme Court decisions, are saying that blacks will not be able to go to college. They won't be able to get good jobs because of all of this. Now, obviously, these are overstatements. Could you go into the elitist concept of those statements?
It's just hilarious. I don't know why. And I was, you know, I have to say I was so grateful for that generous introduction, Alan, but given what I just wrote today in the Wall Street Journal, I'm reluctant to sort of be pulled into the usual, well, here's her Ivy League credentials, because it perpetuates this misunderstanding. My guess is that, heaven forbid, there may be people in this room who didn't go to an Ivy League college and yet they've had perfectly successful careers. The elitism of the pro-preference discourse is utterly nauseating. The idea is that if Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Amherst and Cornell cannot vacuum up deeper and deeper into the black applicant pool, as many blacks as they can, taking them away from the schools where they would otherwise be perfectly and respectively qualified for, that Boston College, that University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, what's not the Boulder flagship? What are some of the other University of Colorado campuses? Or a Colorado State University campus, or in California, which is where I'm from. There are other schools besides UCLA or Berkeley. There's UC Riverside, there's UC Irvine, there's UC Santa Cruz. Those are perfectly respectable schools. There's California State University, there's community colleges. But the idea behind our current pro-affirmative action, I'm going to use that word just to sort of, mix things up a little bit, pro-racial preferences, is that if blacks don't go to Harvard or Cornell or Yale, it's over for them. Where will the future leaders of America come from? How will they ever succeed in college? They'll succeed in college the way all those white students who are going to UC Riverside or UC Irvine or Colorado State University schools do, perfectly well. And what I don't understand is when the chancellor of UC Berkeley, when the voters of California, in their wisdom for once, they may have not recalled Gavin Newsom, they may have put Karen Bass into the LA mayoralty instead of Rick Caruso. They may have not recalled the left-wing prosecutor George Gascon in Los Angeles, but they have twice told California bureaucrats, you will not use race in government. And of course, the bureaucrats thumb their nose. But after they passed Prop 209 the first time around in 1996, thanks to the heroic efforts of the California real estate developer Ward Connerly, the chancellor of UC Berkeley stood up and said, where will California get its future leaders if we can't have racial preferences at UC Berkeley? At that point, the chancellor of California State University should have said, put his hand up and said, they'll get them from California State University. They'll get them from Cal State Riverside. If it is so aspiration crushing for black students to go to a second or third or fourth tier college, why should anybody suffer that fate? Let's close down every third and fourth tier college in the country and send everybody to Harvard. That'll solve the problems. So the elitism of this is really extraordinary. And yet, all of these other college leaders have been perfectly silent, and I cannot begin to come up with an explanation why.
Let's switch a little bit and talk about something that's cheery and positive.
Trans.
No, not yet.
Not yet.
We're saving that. I want to talk about the fact that prosecutors around the country are not following the law. Prosecutors around the country have decided that shoplifting can occur up to $2,000, that all of these things don't have to be prosecuted or punished because it's all based on the fact that there are too many people of color in prison and so forth. This is something that, to me, is destroying the fabric of America. And how did we get here? Why is this happening? It is so utterly destructive. And the second tier of it is the fact that university and college presidents don't punish students when they shout down a speaker on campus. I mean, it's at all different levels. Would you address that in the shortest fashion that you can?
Well, shortest fashion, especially for criminal justice, is race. Okay, next question.
Maybe a little bit more than that.
Let me unpack. Everything, if you've been following what's been going on in criminal justice recently, which is exactly as Alan Altman says, prosecutors are declassifying a whole bunch of crimes, basically saying this is no longer a crime. You can shoplift, you can assault people, you can turnstile jump, you can loot stores, you can rampage, disorderly conduct, you can resist arrest, which is absolutely terrifying to decriminalize that, because if you're saying that you can defy the authority of an officer, you are basically saying we're no longer a civilization, because our police do represent the rule of law. Alan gave away the story it's not usually phrased as he did, because he did say that the reason this is going on is because it has a disparate impact on blacks. Usually, that's not part of the public discourse. White conservatives are so well-meaning that you can listen to Fox News and they will be talking about this problem of depolicing, of deprosecution, of de-incarceration. And they'll say, we just got to start enforcing the law again. This is ridiculous. Why aren't we enforcing the law? And they will tiptoe around the fact of the reason that we're not is because every time you do enforce the law in a colorblind, constitutional, objective matter, it will have a disparate impact on blacks. Not because the law is racist, but because the black rate of criminal offending is very high. Again, trigger warning, things we don't like to talk about. In New York City, let me give you some data. Sorry for the numbers, it's late in the afternoon, we need our tea or coffee. But here's the numbers. Blacks are 22% of the New York City population. They commit anywhere between 71 and 75% of all shootings. In Los Angeles, a black is 37 more times more likely to commit a robbery than a white. We talk about interracial violence. We're all living by lies at this, in our world today. We're supposed to believe that existing while black is very dangerous because of white supremacists. Hilarious. Do you know who commits interracial violence? Blacks. 87% of all interracial violence between blacks and whites on blacks is committed by blacks on whites. Blacks are about 35 times more likely to commit an interracial crime against whites than whites on blacks. Blacks die of homicide at massively higher rates. Between the ages of 10 and 24, blacks die of gun homicide at 25 times the rate of whites. I mean, that just is stunning. Anybody that's got a statistical background, those sorts of disparities don't really exist often in the real world. And the reason that they're dying of gun homicide at 25 times the rate of whites is because they commit gun homicide at 25 times the rate of whites. They're not being killed by the police. They're not being killed by whites. The face of urban street crime in America today is basically black and brown. I'm sorry, this is a very uncomfortable, unpleasant thing to say. I apologize. I'm only saying it because we are now saying that if the police have a disparate impact on blacks, it's because the police are racist. No, that is not the case. They are going where people are being victimized. They are going, answering 911 calls. They're answering shot spotter technologies, and that is taking them almost exclusively to black neighborhoods. And when they try and save black lives, they're called racists. There are dozens of black children that are gunned down every year in drive-by shootings. 1-year-olds, gunned down in their beds, gunned down in their backyards, in their front yards, in their living rooms, in their parents' car, at barbecues and parks, jumping on trampolines. All of these examples, these are kids that have had their brains blown out by drive-by shootings. If white kids were getting gunned down at that rate, there'd be a national revolution. But because they're black kids, the media doesn't care about it. Black Lives Matter activists don't care about it. Joe Biden doesn't care about it. Nancy Pelosi doesn't care about it. Democratic politicians, AOC doesn't care about it because they're being killed by other blacks, and so we can't talk about it. That's why we're not enforcing the law. And until we start saying that the police are not racist, they are simply going where the victims are happening. And we can also say, of course, and Fox News says this, when the police back off, it's black lives that are taken. That is absolutely indisputably true. That doesn't get you far enough, though. You have to say, we are going to enforce the law, and if we have a disparate impact on black criminals, so be it. That is how we make our cities livable again, so that people don't have to fear going on the subway in New York City, taking their kids to school. We cannot allow the phony charge of racism to tear down criminal law enforcement. Sorry, I was not quick about that. But.
Thank you. I am a gynecologist by training. I care for female patients. I was at the post office getting information for a passport. And JR, one of the postal masters here in Aspen, I said, "Thank you so much, sir. You've really helped me." He looked at me and he said, "No, sir." So what do you mean? And then I realized he had undergone at least 15 hours of training about not using pronouns and not saying he or she or sir, because you cannot assume what a person's gender is, okay? As a doctor, I can tell you right now, we have gone nuts. There is a picture on the cover of Glamour magazine of a pregnant man. Wow. That is a pregnant woman who is claiming that she is a man. Two instances very quickly. I have a niece who in high school came out as a lesbian, and then in her 30s decided to become a FTM, a female to male transsexual. She went through the surgical procedures, etc. That's at the age of 30. I also have a niece by marriage who in her early years, up till she was about 12 or 15, said, "Call me David," dressed as a boy. She was a tomboy. And I'm happy to say, and I'll probably get choked up, I've been asked to do the bris on her son, who was born this past week. That's because kids go through this, especially during the teen years. We've seen teen girls, teen boys who are trying to find their sexuality, who are trying to decide where they belong. This is an incredibly stressful time. And so many of these kids, we're in an age of suicide now. Not because they have decided to become trans, but because there's so much stress. And of course, COVID quintupled this stress because they couldn't interact with their peers, with other people. You had to be isolated. That's another story for another time. But we have gone absolutely insane. There's a disease or a condition called gender dysphoria that some people actually have. We can find it throughout their young lives into their older lives. But we have something different now. It's called rapid onset gender dysphoria. That's a whole different story. I have a lot of stress. Catherine over here became Cal. She's a good friend of mine. I've learned online that all I have to say is 3 or 4 things to the doctor, and I can become a guy too. This is social pressure. It's as a physician, I am embarrassed by the medical profession and the way they have conducted themselves in encouraging this kind of thing. There was a wonderful paper that came out about 3-4 months ago looking at thousands of transgender people, 79% of whom call themselves transgender but have had no hormone or surgical procedures done. These are older people. They are perfectly happy that way, and they call themselves transgender. And yet such a huge percentage of boys and girls in their teen years are undergoing these kinds of hormonal anti-puberty drugs and surgery. So I'm sorry for shooting my mouth off, but this is something that is near and dear to me because it's utter insanity. Yes, we should support young people who are confused about this, but the American College of Psychiatry, the American Association of Psychologists have brought on affirmation therapy. How many of you know what affirmation therapy is? Okay, that's frightening. Let me tell you what it is. Normally, when a child comes into a psychologist often says, I want to become, as a girl, I want to become a boy. Okay, the intelligent thing for that physician, that mental health practitioner would be to say, come on, sit down, let's talk. How did you come to this decision? What's going on in your life? How can we look at this and maybe find a different direction? But what affirmation therapy is that they are obligated to do, these mental health professionals, is to say, oh, you want to become a boy? Great, how can I help you? I want to affirm your decision. What's going on here? Where have we lost this? Where did this start? This is such a minute portion of the population, but the activism has gone nuts. They attack Riley Gaines, who's an Olympic swimmer. They attack her physically on a college campus because she's saying, hey, listen, if you have an MTF, a male to female transitioner, make a separate class of athletics for them. That only makes sense. Then they can all compete however they wish to. But to say that he can be part of female sports, is this what we've done to female sports, the way we've elevated over the past 4 or 5 decades so that women have equal treatment, and now we're tearing it down? I'm sorry. Please, tell me what your thoughts are.
Well, let's start with like the lightest aspect of all of this, which is women's sports. I have to say, I love it. I love this battle between the feminists who destroyed male sports. Let's just be honest. They didn't just equalize sports, they destroyed male sports so that they could fund a lot of female sports that have no viewers or whatnot out of, frankly, an anti-male animus. And so, yeah, come on. I can say that, you can't. And so I look on this as like, there's, what's not to like? You've got the feminists fighting with the trans insane people, and if feminists are not willing to stand up to the trans insane people and defend the prerogative of females, then I don't care. Let it both sides eat each other up. But beyond that, this thing is very, very serious, and I think Alan has been way too accommodating to the other side in his statement that children have gone through this always. No, they haven't. There has obviously been insecurity around adolescence. There's been, for millennia of human history, a mind-body dualism and periodic outbreaks of real revulsion towards the flesh, which part of this is what's going on. You have this scourging of the flesh. with the castration and the puberty blockers, but we have this with flagellants in the Middle Ages and hair shirts, and every so often people go through periods where they feel like the body is dross. I'm spirit, and I'm uncomfortable with sexual urges. That is an aspect of human existence that is part of ourselves. So there's a little bit of that in the trans phenomenon. But I think it ultimately grows out of hatred towards everything bourgeois and everything normal. It grows out of hatred towards the two-parent traditional biological family. We're supposed, there are a lot of gay activists who are saying, don't blame us for this. I'm sorry, I think it's somewhat of a slippery slope. Gay pride parades are preposterous from the very beginning. I'm not proud of being female. I don't regard being female as an accomplishment. I don't want to have Female Pride Month. Being female should not advance me into any position, even though it has and does. I am undoubtedly the unwilling beneficiary of gender preferences all my life, and that is disgusting. And I will say this, that being gay or being trans is also not an accomplishment and is nothing to celebrate. And that's true of being black as well. It is an irrelevancy. But the trans thing is a hatred of normalcy, and the degree of mutilation that's going on. I think Alan is also understating the idea that you can fill a young body that is on the freight train of puberty towards sexual maturation and say, whoop, stop it, put on the emergency brakes, we're gonna go 4 or 5 years, and then we've changed our minds and reverse it, and everything's gonna be fine again. It's a preposterous on its face. Too much else has gone on. The doctors, yes, have gone on with this. If you have read a graphic description of what these surgeries entail, it makes you want to throw up. You're sculpting these fake vaginas that keep wanting to sew up again. The body wants to heal itself. And so that the new females have to go back again and again to be mutilated. It is unbelievable that doctors are going along with this. The only thing I can understand about it is that the challenge is so enormous that as a purely technical matter, you are playing God. It is a Frankenstein type creation of a monster. I kind of get it for that. What greater challenge than to try to sculpt ersatz sexual organs that have any plausible way of working, and of course they don't. A male is never going to be able to get pregnant, and a female is never going to be able to impregnate a male. We would have to change trillions of cells and their chromosomal makeup to truly change sex. But this thing is the weirdest thing in human history. There's nothing like it. We've had the French Revolution, we've had the Russian Revolution, we've had peasant revolutions, we've had the Reformation, we've gotten rid of capitalism to the destruction of anybody who lives under a non-capitalist system of life. Nothing could have prepared any of us for the trans revolution. And it is not about teen insecurity. The teens are being fed a script by ideologues. It gives them what every teen craves, which is power. You have the adult under your finger because they are not using your right pronouns. This is what every teen longs for. It's just too bad that we're giving them this power by self-mutilation. And the right is far too accommodating to even be talking about gender dysphoria, like how often is it, none of this is real. None of it. We did not have gender dysphoria 20 years ago. This thing is completely a phenomenon created by ideologues to sterilize the West. That is what it is ultimately about, which is the great replacement, to make sure that as few people living in the West can reproduce as possible. And I'm not one for conspiracy theories, and I generally want to stay away from truly apocalyptic rhetoric, but this thing is so weird that it asks for equally weird explanations.
And the Marxist concept here, which I always go back to, is the fact that this is another way to destroy the family unit.
Yes.
You see parents being told, and this happened in 2005. I had a patient in my office who came in crying. I said, "What's the matter?" And by the way, I'm going to admit something terrible. I hugged her while she was crying. I could have lost my license today for doing that. I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "My son came home from high school. He's 17. And he said to my husband and I'm going to become a girl." And we laughed, that's historical. Sure, you're going to become a girl. He said, no, you don't understand. I have been working with my school counselor for the last 18 months setting this up. And I'm telling you that if you object to it, the school will call the police. This is the way you destroy a family. So the upshot of this is that when you pass laws to say, like in Florida, we're not going to permit this kind of surgery and puberty blockers, the left stands up, the activists stand up and say, these children are going to commit suicide. The real cause of suicide is having this done and regretting it so much. It was one individual who's been on the web, her video, talking about reverting from, she was female to male, now she's going back to being female. And she said something that is so important to understand. She said, when my friends started to do this, and then I thought I might do it, everyone was so supportive. My parents supported me. My teachers encouraged me. And I thought this must be the right thing to do because these are the people supporting me. And that's what I look back and I can't believe nobody said, stop for a minute and think about this. Think about what you're going to undergo. This destroys the family. This is Marxism.
Yeah, no. Again, this thing is so weird, you have to reach for very deep explanations. It destroys the family, and the next step is it makes people infertile. I mean, that's what's happening. Every person that's going through the puberty blockers, the sex changes, they're all infertile. So that's not a bug. It's the whole point of the whole thing. It's very, very scary. And the weird thing is I've made one foray in writing now into the trans phenomenon on City Journal. I recommend you look it up, but it's about the fact that the left gets to always set the default. It is the most amazing thing. They have introduced policies that represent thinking of the nanosecond of a millisecond in millennia of human history. Nobody 30 years ago would have had a clue what any of us were talking about when we're talking about trans females and all this. It would have been like, what in the world are you saying? And yet now, that is the default. They get to say that the default is that schools get to keep away from parents the encouragement that they're giving their students to become the opposite sex. And so if a parent or a law says, no, you actually have to notify the parents that we're assigning different pronouns, that would have to defend itself. The left doesn't have to defend, it doesn't have any burden of proof in creating policies that are completely insane. They immediately become the norm. And then when DeSantis stands up and says, no, we need parental consent, you just have to notify the parents, that's all we're asking. Oh, that's transphobic. It's just amazing. And any laws against castrating and mutilating children, oh, that's what has to defend itself. The castrating and mutilating children never had to defend itself. That becomes the new default. That becomes the new norm, that anybody fighting against it has the burden of proof to challenge. The left's power over cultural discourse is simply extraordinary. And as for this amazing emotional blackmail that you hear, that there's a phrase that gets pointed again and again in sort of the trans skeptical literature, which is what they'll say is, do you want a dead daughter or a live boy? So you've got a daughter, and they'll say, do you want a dead daughter who's committed suicide or a live son? And it's just BS. And you're not allowed to ask, well, maybe the mental distress preceded the trans denial. Maybe you're very troubled person to begin with. The suicides are very rare. The numbers are very rare. But maybe if you did commit suicide, it's not because of the trans change denial, it's because you were a very troubled person to begin with. But we're all supposed to pretend that insisting on trans is a sign of mental health. I'm not even sure it's a sign of mental distress, because again, as Alan said, the social advantages to declaring yourself trans in a peer group now are so enormous. You're going to have the President of the United States who is flying a damn trans flag at the White House, saying that trans people are the soul and courage of the nation, and that he's never met more courageous people in his life than trans people. And I'm quoting him verbatim. So if you're just some poor white boy who's studying physics, AP physics in 10th grade, because he wants to discover the secrets of the universe, he is not going to get a commendation from the president. But if you say to your teacher and your fellow students, please call me Hank instead of Heather, the president is going to say, you are the most courageous person I've ever known.
Speaking of courageous, people need to stand up. And there are some bright spots around the country. We had Josh Dunn, the professor of poli-sci here last week, the Institute for the Understanding of Government and Learning the Constitution and learning what the Declaration of Independence says. And he's going from Colorado, CU, to Tennessee, and there Tennessee is setting up a whole institute for him again. So things like that are beginning to have a dent. The University of North Carolina Medical School has said, we're not following anything the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee decided for us. We are going back to merit advancement and entry into medical school. A number of schools quietly are starting to do this. Then there's ESG, which I'd like you to just briefly explain in the corporate world, and what has over the last year happened backlash-wise, because that at least shows that we still have some power to stand up and stop this craziness.
Well, for now, we have the power for now, and use it while we've got it. I do not understand why any parent is using any Disney products. For one, they bastardize children's stories. I was fortunate enough to read the original Winnie the Pooh stories by A.A. Milne, and the gorgeous, incredibly insightful, just imaginative illustrations by Shepard that are, you cannot replicate these. I wasn't subjected to the cartoon version of Winnie the Pooh. I did enjoy Snow White and Cinderella, I guess, cartoons growing up, but Disney was a very different company back then. There are lots of alternatives to Disney. Educate yourself, or have your children educate themselves for your grandchildren about the great tradition of British children's literature, American children's literature, Stuart Little, Charlotte's Web, Americans, the Phantom Tollbooth. We've got some fantastic books out there. The Disney franchise right now is evil. It decided to absolutely misrepresent what Ron DeSantis was doing in Florida. All he said was, it is not appropriate to rub the nose of young children into a premature knowledge of sexuality. You will not teach sexual topics to third grade year old. That means, yes, not teaching about gayness, but it also means you don't teach about heterosexuals. It's all irrelevant. As far as I'm concerned, no time is a good time for sex education. The parents should be doing it. But at best, okay, maybe 10th grade. But childhood is something precious. You want children to have a sphere of innocence in their past that they can go back to and believe in animals that speak and fairies and the possibility of transforming yourself. All Ron DeSantis was doing was saying, do not destroy our children. And Disney said, you're saying don't say gay. Completely misrepresenting, got corporate boycotts. DeSantis is engaged in a Herculean fight against Disney, but they have completely thrown their corporate brand and reputation in with the woke destroyers of American civilization. And so there's been some pushback on that, but the really good thing is with the Bud Light, with their promotion of trying to rebrand Bud Light as the beer for the trans population, they are not selling. Bud Light cases are now, they're stacked up in Target and Walmart and whatnot because people are not buying them. They can't make you buy things yet. So there is a possibility of pushing back against these brands. Exploit it while you can, because I'm enough of a pessimist that I think that the government will come up with a way to get us to buy the woke remakes of action films. Now, I don't really love action films. To me, it's like so boy, and I don't usually identify as particularly female, but when I see like trailers for like the current usual crop of it, they're so damn ugly. You've got this weird Star Trek or Star Wars type blend of medieval iconography with like super modern iconography, and it's all just tacky, and it's just the taste of a 14-year-old boy. I don't want to see it, but they're remaking these cartoon epics to be all about, the trans, lesbian, black. No males can be heroes anymore. It's all females. And those movies bomb at the box office. So they can't make you pay for them yet, but they'll figure out a way. They'll figure out a way that Pixar can go woke, that Disney can go woke, and they'll somehow take the money out of your bank account to make sure that we can have a unopposed set of woke cultural products. And I sort of think the same thing might happen with voting. Unlike our lunch friends today, I actually do believe we still have a fairly honest voting system. I don't think, and many people here may disagree with me, but I think that our elections are still pretty trustworthy, and I'm actually going to say I think the 2020 elections, the results, I stand by them. But I don't think that's going to last necessarily forever. And so now we still have the vote and we have to use it.
I think we can tell by the fact that up until 2 minutes ago, nobody left. And we're getting to dinner time, so I must say that we appreciate your presence. We probably have time for 2 questions, and that I would encourage people to come up safely and talk to Heather. And please, her book is in back. It is an incredible book. When Race Trumps Merit. Why'd you put Trump in there? Anyway, When Race Trumps Merit, get it. It is really, you can see who wrote it and how she speaks and the topics that she touches on. So we have time for 2 questions.
Thank you. I'm so impressed with you. I wish you were my best friend. Do you have any idea statistically what part of our population is woke and to this left-wing crazy way of thinking, because they are getting all the marketing and publicity? And is there some way that people in their right minds could possibly get more publicity for the fact that we believe it and are people of normal values?
Yeah, that's a great question. There was a study that got a lot of attention among writers in the last year or two that purported to say that actually the number of real crazies is very small. That the white progressives are sort of the worst and everybody else is sort of okay. I'm actually not totally persuaded by this. I think that young people have been brainwashed for decades of their lives. That's what's turning these corporations woke. Employees and wives are the big problems with corporations. Wives are driving their CEOs to their husbands to the left. And God forbid we have more female CEOs. And I'm sorry for the females in the room. I'm sure you're all completely CEO material, but a lot of people that are being promoted are not. They're being promoted by sex. Irrelevant. So I think it's pretty bad. And so I think we need more conservative funders of classical academies, homeschooling. We need to make that more available. There has to be a very strong counter revolution for this, because things are not as good as we think. Now, I live in 2 blue states, so if I lived in a red state, I might have a different view of things, that there still is a solid core of people with common sense, but we're losing it quickly, whatever Alan rightly says about some efforts. And those of you who are from Florida, please spread the word about DeSantis. I love the guy. He does not get enough credit.
As a counterpoint, we all need to go back to the libraries, check out the books that they're putting out, and keep them out. Or we have a man in Aspen that has huge amount of books in his car, and he keeps them, and that's how we can fight back for this. We've got to.
So it's not burn the books, it's check out the books. I like that. That's a good thing.